The wealth of old Monaco announces itself in textures that decline to speak. Marble that feels cooler than the air. Lacquer that does not reflect you so much as decide whether you belong in its mirror. Leather-bound doors that yield at a touch with the quiet of a well-trained bird. There is a way of placing a coffee cup on a saucer that tells you bills are paid on time across generations. There is a slowness to the elevators and a softness to the carpets that you come to recognize as a moral code. In Monte Carlo, silence has become a currency, traded in glances between doormen and chauffeurs, in the discipline of a wrist that never checks a watch because everything essential will happen as it always has. Eventually, the sea presses against the cliff like a sealed letter. The yachts moor without fuss. You find yourself listening for a noise that never comes, the audible proof that money is alive. Instead, you feel it, pervasive as a scent, reserved as a verdict, present in the white margins where other countries keep their footnotes. Old money prefers a jurisdiction that learns how to disappear. It does not chase headlines, it edits them. Monte Carlo became the tidy margin for fortunes written elsewhere, a residence that felt like the final punctuation mark after a century of accumulation. To understand why, one must place velvet to one side and pick up a ledger. The principality learned early that sovereignty can be a balance sheet. Instead of the tangled catechism of income taxes, wealth taxes, and capital levies that convulse larger states, Monaco embraced an economy where the primary public revenue came from a combination of gaming concessions, consumption taxes transmitted through treaties, and a web of state-anchored real estate. The result is not simply a low tax pitch. It is a philosophy of legal predictability, where the absence of intrusion is the product being sold. For dynastic families, predictability is oxygen. They do not plan in quarters, they plan in grandchildren. Consider the architects of this quiet model. In the 19th century, the casino concession was not a moral lapse, but a sovereign instrument. It married capital-hungry nobility to entrepreneurial financiers in a legal marriage of convenience. The house that hosted the card tables also learned to play a longer game with property. Land, once an afterthought, became the principality's enduring engine, with the state curating scarcity as if curating a museum. That scarcity, amplified by geography and by policy, generates a rental income that smooths volatility, letting Monaco do something rare in modern governance. It can keep promises. For industrial dynasties tired of being rewritten by each new government, that reliability reads like a family portrait rescued from a fire. The mechanism that draws the old industrial fortunes is not merely the absence of an income levy, it is the legal architecture that comes with residence, the way residence interacts with domicile, the quiet interplay between civil codes, treaties, and asset vehicles. A family that minted its wealth in steel, chemicals, or shipping will have companies in multiple jurisdictions, each carrying different tax and inheritance rules. Monte Carlo offers a residence base where the individual's annual exposure is limited, while ownership is rearranged to sit within corporate forms that harmonize with outside laws. A monegasque joint stock company can hold equity and property while observing a principle that matters to those who are done with risk for its own sake. The company becomes a cold room for assets, limiting operational mess while keeping family control intact through tailored share classes and voting agreements. The individual becomes a resident. The capital becomes a citizen of the balance sheet. It is instructive to think in the language of jurists rather than bankers, to speak of bonds of law rather than coupons. Domicile governs what happens when a person dies. Residence governs what happens while they live. Many countries tax the worldwide estate of those domiciled there regardless of where they sleep. Old wealth, therefore, cultivates a second discipline after profit, the art of being from somewhere else on paper. Monaco plays this game with meticulous restraint, insisting on proof of means, proof of accommodation, proof of good standing, and then allowing time to oxidize the documentation into a new normal. Over years, the rhythm of residence and the absence of certain levies accrue not as a loophole, but as a life. The calendar does part of the structuring by sanding away doubt. The families that understand this do not move quickly. They simply stop moving. In this world of hushed compliance, the most interesting instruments are sometimes philosophical. Civil law countries cherish the split between usufruct and bare ownership, a way to transfer the substance of an asset, while postponing the moment when another generation truly holds it. The elder retains the fruit, the younger receives the tree. In a place like Monaco, that doctrine becomes choreography. Parents can enjoy the income from portfolios while children hold title, a reversible arrangement that keeps family harmony and tax exposure in a controlled orbit. Combine that with family companies whose shares carry graduated rights, and one can conduct succession like a string quartet rather than a courtroom brawl. The music is legal, the silence afterwards priceless. Monaco's banks are complicit in this quiet, in the way a good archivist is complicit in the endurance of a library. Private bankers here are less salesmen than stewards, the custodians of consolidated reporting that allows patriarchs and matriarchs to read their empires as a single page. Their reputation rests not on adventurous yield, but on the absence of accidents. Even the investment philosophy of the better houses has the humility of old stone. Portfolios tilt to quality equities, with reliable dividends, government bonds of admirable dullness, and private lending against assets that can be touched. Return is defined as staying rich in a noisy century. The performance metric is the generation that did not need to sell the family's first company to correct a clever mistake. There is a reason sociologists and economists circle this rock with a mixture of fascination and disdain. Thorstein Veblen would say the principality refines the institutions of leisure into symbols that communicate stability, that the refusal to fuss is itself a language of class. Pierre Bourdieu would recognize the compound of economic capital with social capital and what he called symbolic capital, the way a Monte Carlo address functions as a credential in salons where nothing is said directly. Thomas Piketty might gesture at the compounded returns of capital, sheltered from progressive levies, and wonder at a polity where policy and property clasp hands. Yet even these frameworks miss something that old families know in their bones. Wealth is governance enacted in miniature. It is the capacity to make rules for one's own house that outlast the lifespan of any single resident. Rarely discussed outside the Riviera is the Pastor family, a dynasty that quietly became landlord to a city-state. Their story is less glamorous than a yacht and more instructive than a hedge fund. Beginning in construction, they compelled concrete to obey a vision of patient accumulation. Apartment buildings, offices, and developments were not flamboyant plays but modular steps, in a strategy where rent is oxygen and sale is betrayal. Over decades, their footprint helped set the price of land and the tone of urban development, granting them a form of influence more durable than a ministerial portfolio. In a place where supply is bounded by stone and sea, the owner of walls does not need to raise his voice. He only needs to renew a lease. The lesson for industrial fortunes is clear. Owning the pipes of an economy might make you rich. Owning the walls of a jurisdiction makes you permanent. Less known to the general audience are the 19th century financiers who underwrote Monte Carlo's early transformation and exported its ethos. Widows who managed concessions with a stern ledger. Speculators who learned to become administrators once the tables were balanced. These were the tutors of an idea. The idea is disarmingly simple. Sovereignty can be monetized without surrendering its dignity if you turn it into a guarantee rather than a spectacle. Monaco learned to guarantee non-interference, to guarantee clean registries, to guarantee that luxury would be curated rather than flaunted. Old industrial money, allergic to the fickle temper of politics, heard the promise that the law here would be less eager to make an example of them. The promise held, They came as if arriving at a library between wars. One must also acknowledge the modern pressures that test this quiet pact. The global choreography of information exchange has made secrecy a trivial skill and compliance the higher art. Yet Monte Carlo adapted with the elegance of a well-cut suit, re-tailored rather than replaced. The banks learned to collect documentation without losing clients. The registry learned to satisfy inquiries without turning into a gossip column. Families rephrase structures rather than abandon them, moving from nameless accounts to named companies, from ornamented secrecy to honest simplicity. What did not change was the principle that a resident should know in advance what the state wants from them. In a century of shifting obligations, that alone is worth more than a favorite view. Another unglamorous device, rarely passed by popular culture, is the way European succession rules have allowed cross-border families to choose which law will speak at the bedside. For a matriarch who resides in Monaco but owns an apartment in a city that follows a different code, the choice of applicable law can prevent a forced division that would crack a family's asset map. Lawyers here treat jurisdictions like chess pieces, not to evade legality, but to achieve coherence. The aim is to let financial geography mirror family geography, to ensure that the rules that govern love and grievance also govern shareholder agreements. That alignment feels like grace when a patriarch dies and the city does not notice a single light flicker. In the shadow of the casino stand companies whose shares are never gambled with. Monaco's joint stock form, reserved and bureaucratic in the best sense, allows families to wrap their holdings in a local skin while the meat remains international. It is not a shell in the disreputable sense. It is a home address for capital as it waits out crises or prepares a new acquisition. It also permits the salami tactics of internal succession. Parcels of non-voting stock can be distributed to children as proofs of affection without surrendering the tiller. Voting blocks can be housed in entities that are pledged to neutral decision rules, so that a single heir cannot wake up and sell the second factory that made the family name. In this architecture, the company outlives the quarrels. That is what dynasties pay for. The ethic of Monte Carlo also disciplines public life. The state is small enough to be personal, which makes neutrality a survival trait. Its princes learned that pageantry must support policy, never the reverse. They broker with neighbors to integrate what does not need reinvention, from customs regimes to telephony, and conserve energy for what matters, the curation of reputation. That curation is not costume. It is law in its most refined form, the soft power of a brand that is actually a constitution. By standing for discretion and competence, the principality protects the compounding of private plans. You sense this when a property transaction concludes with nothing but a nod. You sense it again when a philanthropic gala raises funds like a metronome rather than a frenzy. The rhythm is everything. For the viewer curious about the machinery rather than the myth, the lesson is unromantic and therefore valuable. The families who endure treat jurisdictional choice as part of investment policy. They do not regard tax as a dragon to be slain, but as a climate to be chosen. They structure ownership so that cash flow and control can be separated when necessary and reunited when wise. They educate heirs in the grammar of law, the difference between the fruits of an asset and its bare title, the difference between the company that pays them and the holding that protects them. They build relationships with bankers who can say no without losing the account. They choose philanthropy that is continuous rather than episodic, because a giving program is also a way to train younger hands to sign without shaking. To those outside the salon, it is tempting to see only spectacle, the gardens and the cars and the illusions that money buys. The truth, as always, is less photogenic and more consequential. Monaco's power is the quiet capacity to make long plans, survive the short temptations of the age. In an era where policy shifts like weather and fortunes evaporate in one bad quarter, the principality stands for the unfashionable virtues of continuity and restraint. It is a place where the most radical decision is the decision not to change the rules that work. Old industrial money, taught by factories and freight schedules to respect reliability, recognizes a kindred intelligence behind the linen. Even within this composure there are human shadows, choices that are neither clean nor sordid but simply practical. Heirs who tire of bureaucracy give up control and move to write novels. Patriarchs who love control more than dividends keep both and discover that their children learn other languages. Some families dissolve under the weight of the very order they built. Others thrive because the rules are a relief from emotion rather than a substitute for it. Monte Carlo has room for these variations because the stage never upstages the players. The setting remains constant, letting characters change without collapsing the play. The conclusion is not a moral but a map. Power that survives does so by wearing architecture. Monte Carlo is one such architecture, a carefully arranged set of predictabilities that turn capital into a resident rather than a refugee. The principality does not invent fortunes, it edits them. It teaches the patient industrialist how to become a landlord to his own posterity, the shipowner how to dock his shares in a harbour that believes in harbours. In the morning the sea looks the same. In the evening, lights come on behind curtains that do not show off. The rest of the world confuses noise with importance. Here, importance is the refusal to break the spell. The watcher leaves the terrace educated and faintly haunted, newly alert to the fact that in the private logic of old money, the quietest places do the loudest work.